Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming along to listen to me talk about my political hero. And I'm hoping that by the time I've told you all about her, then if she's not your new political hero, then at least you'll understand why she's mine as a very inspiring person. I'm going to talk you through this PowerPoint. Minnie, apparently, well, there are various meanings of the name Minnie, but the one I reckon is most suitable for this one is rebel. It's a familiar name of a Hebrew name, which means rebel. And as you can see from that, well, you probably can't see from that birth certificate because it's a little bit small. She was born in 1889. Born in 1889 in East London, and she was the second child of Isaac Glassman and Annie Goodkin. So Isaac and Annie Glassman. She had an older sister, Selina, who is Selina's grandmother, and then younger sisters and two younger brothers as well. And somewhere in there also there was a baby who died tragically, but not at all unusually in that era. Okay, so Minnie's parents, to my best guess, having researched it as much as I can, came from this place, a place called Zakroczym, which is about 35 kilometers from Warsaw in what is now Poland, but which was then Polish Russia. And Zakroczym, which means river crossing, it was a town with a very significant Jewish population. And what happened during the latter part of the 19th century is that the Tsarist regime in Russia very severely repressed its Jewish population. So Jews were banned from various areas of public life. They were forced into jobs doing financial transactions and kind of bailiff type jobs. Interesting that lives on in the modern day anti-Semitic stereotype connecting Jews with money. It's not a modern day stereotype at all. It's got deep historical roots. And the Russian state conscripted Jewish kids, like early teenagers, into the army, and their families often never saw them again. They banned Hebrew being spoken, etc., etc. And then following the assassination of Tsar Alexander by a group of people, which include one Jewish person, that was taken as a pretext for a wave of anti-Semitic pogroms across this area, and tens of thousands of Jewish families fled and headed towards Britain and towards America. And so Isaac and Annie Glassman were among those who fled with their little baby Selina, and they arrived in East London. And arriving in East London, Isaac took up work as a boot finisher. Now, boot finisher was real casualised labour. Boots at the time were handmade, and there was like different jobs for each stage of the boot making. And as you can guess from the word finisher, he did the bit that was the last stage. But when I say this was casualised, this would involve hanging out on Whitechapel Market in a hire parade to get picked to see if you even got any work that week. So as boot finishing kind of came under threat as an occupation, as things got more mechanised, and presumably wanting a more stable income for himself and his family, Isaac then became a coal dealer. And so they're living in Whitechapel in East London. A lot of the historical records refer to it as being a coke dealer, which is apparently still quite a popular profession in those parts. But yeah, joking aside, he was a man with a horse and cart, the equivalent then of a man with a van, going around selling coal and coke to households and companies. Unfortunately, so the Glassman family were part of a large and compact working class Jewish community in East London. And they had, by coming here, I guess, liberated themselves from the vicious anti-Semitism of the Tsar. But arriving in London, they weren't completely free of anti-Semitism. And Isaac actually was assaulted by two guys who were convicted of the assault, which was described in the newspaper headline as an unprovoked assault on a Jew. So the Glassman family lived there, Chicksand Street in the East End of London. For those of you familiar with the area, it's just off Brick Lane. And the Glassman kids went to this school. I'm presuming that's a photograph of that school after it became derelict and they didn't actually go to a school with broken windows. But that was Chicksand Street Elementary School at the end of their road. And from 1870, working class kids of only primary school age started getting compulsory state provided education for the first time, and a load of schools were built, and this was one of them. But after a few years, Minnie left this school and went to this school. And this school is the Jews-free school where her older sister, Selina, was already going. And the Jews-free school was located in Bell Lane, which is about a 10-minute walk to the west of where they lived, near Liverpool Street Station, in one of the most run-down and overcrowded parts of London. It was, by all accounts, the single largest school in the world at the time. Approximately 4,000 Jewish kids attended this school every day. And it was a school whose ethos was about anglicising Jewish kids. They didn't let the kids speak Yiddish, which is the language they'd have spoken at home. They didn't let them speak that in school. And they wanted them to integrate into English society. Now, come the age of 12 or 13, Minnie would have been expected to just stop education and, you know, get a job or go into service or work with the family firm, as they did have a family firm, the coat dealership. But she had different ideas. So at that time, that's when your compulsory free state education finishes. And you can only carry on to what we call secondary school if you've got a grant. And grants are available from the London County, well, or if you're rich, obviously, but they weren't rich. Grants were available from the London County Council, but only to kids who were already in London County Council schools. And Minnie wasn't. She was in the Jews-free school, which was a charitably funded school. But eventually she got herself a grant from a charitable body called the Poplar Trust. And she ended up going to this school here, which is the Coburn School on Bow Road in East London. And the building it was in is actually now the building that houses Central Foundation Girls' School, for those of you who are familiar with East London. And while she was there, Minnie decided that what she wanted to be was a school teacher. So she became what was called a pupil teacher. She studied, you know, which was a new system that had been brought in to make sure teachers were trained properly and good at teaching as well as doing their knowledge. And then having passed all her relevant exams there, she moved on to study to qualify to be a teacher at Goldsmiths College. And there is her name on the admissions list there. And after a couple of years at Goldsmiths College, so Goldsmiths College is in New Cross, so I'm kind of imagining her travelling by steam train from Whitechapel to New Cross on what is now the London Overground East London route. After a couple of years there, she graduated as a teacher, but there was a real problem with teacher unemployment at the time. It was described by a kind of maverick Liberal member of the London County Council at the time as the problem was that they'd trained and qualified too many teachers. I suspect actually the problem was that they had 100 kids per class, and maybe they needed more classes rather than fewer teachers. So she was unemployed for a year after she graduated, but then she eventually got a job in that school there, and that's in East London. That's Fairclough Road School. Again, for those of you familiar with East London, it's not called Fairclough Street School anymore. It's called the Harry Gosling School. It's quite ironic as Harry Gosling crops up in her story later. Anyway, so there she is. She's an infants teacher, and she's doing her job, and she's being paid less than men are being paid for doing exactly the same job as her in the next classroom to her. Minnie gets involved in the National Union of Teachers, and she goes along to the East London Teachers Association, still going strong in East London, and she raises her concerns. She becomes the collector for the subs-collector for the union at the school. It's a brand new school, so the union hasn't really organised there properly yet. And along with other comrades, she raises a motion about equal pay for women teachers, only to see it voted down. And in fact, the NUT at the time, not only did it not insist on equal pay for women, it actually submitted pay claims to the employers that included scales that had women paid less than men. So they were actually, you know, demanding an equal pay. So she thought maybe she'd have some better luck then if she proposed a motion about votes for women, because by this time, Minnie, very strong supporter of the suffrage movement, wanting votes for women. One of the important things to remember about Minnie is where she's growing up. So she's growing up in the Jewish East End, hugely working class area with a very strong labour movement, and also a very strong Jewish community, many of whom had fled political as well as ethnic and religious persecution. So there was lots of lefties amongst them. So she goes and proposes, again with another comrade, a motion about supporting votes for women. Only to see that voted down as well. And that was voted down by people saying it's not the place of the NUT to pass policies on political issues. So if you hear anyone in your union saying, well, we shouldn't get involved in politics, you might remember that that argument has got a long and very dishonourable history. Okay, so Minnie gets involved in the East London Federation of the Suffragettes. Now, most of us are taught, or it's certainly taught at schools, that there were two wings of the suffragettes. There were the kind of the polite, nice ones who lobbied peacefully, and then there were the militant ones who threw bricks, and they were led by Emmeline Pankhurst. But actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because although the ones led by Emmeline Pankhurst were more militant, they were also quite narrow in their demands. They wanted votes for women on the same terms as votes for men. And at that time, a very large number of working class men didn't have the vote. So actually, they weren't campaigning for the enfranchisement of all women, because their demand would only have enfranchised a few, which earned them the rather derogatory nickname of votes for ladies. But the East End suffragette movement, led by Emmeline's daughter Sylvia, wasn't like that. It was working class based. It wanted votes for everyone, and that was the movement that Minnie got involved in. Okay, then in 1914, she married George Lansbury's son Edgar. So George Lansbury was the best known socialist in the East End, one of the best known socialists in the country, and one of the best known male supporters of votes for women in the country as well. Unfortunately, newlywed bliss was rather ruined by a war coming along, and the war started at the beginning of August in 1914. And the East London Federation of the Suffragettes, which Minnie had got involved in, was in a bit of a kind of problem at the time, really, because its leading members like Minnie and like Sylvia Pankhurst and supporters like George Lansbury were against the war. But a lot of the ordinary members were in favour of the war. They got caught up in a kind of jingoism and support for the military adventures, etc. So what they decided to do was to not take a position for or against the war, but to carry on campaigning for votes for women, which other suffrage organisations weren't doing, and to do kind of practical community-based work supporting women in the East End who were being made even poorer than they already were by the onset of war, and to keep making political points about the impact of war on working class women. So the East London Suffragettes did things like they set up a cost price restaurant, they set up a nursery. So that's a picture of the nursery there, and that's a picture of the blue plaque that is on the site of the nursery there, because it's an interesting kind of cute little story here. It used to be a pub called the Gunmaker's Arms because it was around the corner from the munitions factory. But when the Suffragettes took it over and did it up and reopened it as a daycare centre for babies and toddlers, they renamed it the Mother's Arms. The kind of symbolism of this wasn't lost on people. And Israel Zangwill, who was a socialist Jewish activist in East London at the time, said the future of the world lies in changing the Gunmaker's Arms to the Mother's Arms. And this is what Sylvia Pankhurst had to say about Minnie Lansbury. She said she knew the district and people. She was prepared to make herself unreservedly the advocate of the people and to get the best she could for them. I always felt I could trust Minnie to realise that under the veneer we humans are all very much alike, and that the most we could get for our poor was very much less than we all of us need, and a wretched makeshift indeed for the social equality and assurance we desire. I was more than glad of her aid. A dear girl, I thought her, and think so still, though I lost touch with her towards the close of her brief life. Okay, so in So in 1915, maybe Minnie has had enough of banging her head against the brick walls of East London Teachers Association meetings. Maybe she's had enough of the dreadful conditions of working in schools. Maybe she's just got more enthusiastic about the suffragettes. Whatever, what she does is she gives up her job as a school teacher and she becomes a full-time worker for the East London Federation of Suffragettes as assistant secretary, Sylvia Pankhurst being the secretary. And then at the beginning of 1916, the East London Federation changes its name to the Workers' Suffrage Federation, firstly to emphasise that it wants to vote for all workers, men and women, all working class people, votes for everyone. And secondly, because it's beginning to expand beyond East London, branches are being set up around the country. And there we see its kind of launch appeal for people to join. And if you look closer, you can see at the bottom Minnie Lansbury's name on that, alongside 3 others. Okay, she very much specialised in the war pensions campaigning of the Workers' Suffrage Federation. And after a lot of campaigning, campaigners managed to persuade the government to set up a war pensions fund and local committees to administer that fund. And she became a member of that committee. And this is a quote from the gloriously named Reverend Henry Kitcat, who was the chair of the Poplar War Pensions Committee until Minnie took over from him as the chair. And he said, often at the expense of her strength, she laboured first to help the whole staff of the office in carrying out their duties, but above all to do all that could be done for the thousands of ex-servicemen. Minnie had a wonderful comprehension of the ever-changing regulations by which the Pensions Committee was governed. And here's a quote from her husband, Edgar Lansbury, who said, although she strove hard to alleviate suffering, she always looked forward to the day when preventable misery and economic injustice would be no more. And I think this is a really interesting question for us today, which might be one of the things people want to talk about, which is how you balance trying to change the world with alleviating the suffering of the people in the world at the moment. Because you don't want to spend all your time helping the victims of capitalism while capitalism just carries on treating people badly and you never get to the root and you never change the system. On the other hand, you don't get much of an audience. You just spend all your time lecturing people on why they need to change the system and never do anything to help people with their immediate needs. And so I think for her and for Minnie and her comrades, it was a constant kind of balancing act between those two things. Okay, so as the war went on, people had been told at the start of the war it'd be over by Christmas. It wasn't. As the war went on, that patriotic fervour that I referred to earlier kind of died down more, and it became a bit easier for people to hold demonstrations calling for peace. And at the end of 1916, there was such a demonstration at the East India dock gates, and Sylvia was there, and Minnie was there, and her husband Edgar was there, and it got attacked by pro-war thugs and the police as well. And Minnie got arrested. Well, Edgar got arrested, and then Minnie got arrested for jogging alongside Edgar while he was being arrested. And they and Sylvia and a couple of others were up in court the next day. But the charges against Minnie and Edgar were thrown out. So they tried to conscript Edgar Lansbury. He had to appeal against it. He won his appeal. That must have been a very difficult time for them. Okay, then 1917 comes along, Russian Revolution. Everyone in Britain's British Labour movement was really enthused by that. Minnie included, but the Workers' Suffrage Federation, which is now called the Workers' Socialist Federation, split away from the Labour Party, and Minnie stayed with Labour. So at that point, she and Sylvia parted ways. And in 1920, when the Communist Party of Great Britain was formed, Minnie and Edgar joined it. They were still in the Labour Party. You could be in the Labour Party and the Communist Party at the time. Okay. After the war, there was a set of elections. Tory-Liberal coalition won the general elections, called straight after the end of the war. But as you went into 1919, newly enfranchised working class voters started voting more in their own interest. They elected more Labour candidates than before for the London County Council and the Guardians, who ran the Poor Law. And then they swept the board in the Poplar Borough Council elections. And that's a photo of lots of Poplar Borough councillors newly elected at the end of 1919. And they appointed Minnie, circled in red, as one of their aldermen, which was a kind of ranking between councillor and mayor. And they set about doing lots of radical pro-working class things because, as George Lansbury said, Labour councillors must be different from those we have displaced, or why displace them? often tempted to kind of make a postcard out of that quote and send it to all our Labour councillors around the country. Useful reminder. So they did loads of great things with maternity and TB dispensary and housing and stuff, electrification, decasualising of work. And there they are in their town hall. There's Minnie down there, circled in red. Then they hit a financial crisis, recession, and an unfair funding system where basically councils had to raise money from their local populace. So if you're in a poor area, you needed to provide loads of services but had very little resources to tax to do it. So they demanded that rates be equalised, that richer areas put more money in so poorer areas could get more money out. But that wasn't what the law was. So in the end, rather than go bankrupt or make cuts or put up rates any further, the Poplar Council decided to defy the law and refuse to collect the extra bits of rates to hand over to the London County Council and others. Because as Ed Lansbury said, the law and justice are two different things. Okay, so the London County Council took them to court. There was court hearings. This is a massive march from the East End of London to the High Court to hear the case against them. But they were proud to be breaking the law because they said, well, we either obey the law and take services away from the people who elected us, or we defy the law because it's a bad law. Okay, because I'm running out of time. I'm not going to play you this video, but I'll play it at the end if you like. Okay. But eventually, so at the end of September in 1921, they get arrested. This is Minnie arriving at Poplar Town Hall to be arrested alongside 4 other women councillors. 25 men councillors were also arrested and taken to Brixton Prison. Huge crowds gathered there to hear them give a speech. As far as I can tell, that's the one and only public speech Minnie Lansbury ever did, was when she was just about to be arrested. And off they go in the sheriff's car to Holloway Prison, where they asked the prison officers to show them their union card and refused to wear the official badges. But Minnie was soon taken ill and was in the hospital wing. But while she was in prison, she did an interview with a communist newspaper and set out that she actually had a more radical and militant approach to this fight than some of the other councillors did. They were united, but they still had different opinions. Eventually, 2 other local councils, Stepney and Bethnal Green, voted to defy the law in the same way that Poplar had. And at that point, the government backed down. And on the 12th of October 1921, the councillors were released. They've made no compromise. They had won. There they are outside Brixton Prison. There's Minnie, circled in red. And what they'd won was a new financial system where the rich boroughs put more in and the poor boroughs got more out. And a right-wing Labour MP by the name of Jimmy Thomas, who was General Secretary of the National Union of Railwaymen at the time, he said, "This is a great discouragement to those who believe in constitutional action and a great encouragement to those who believe in revolutionary methods." I completely agree with him, except the fact that he thought that was a bad thing. There's their celebration rally in Victoria Park. I would really like to be able to end the story here, or indeed continue it for about 2 hours about all the other wonderful things that Minnie Lansbury did in her life. But unfortunately, weakened by her time in prison, she caught the flu over Christmas 1921, became pneumonia, and she died. There's some medical evidence actually that it was like a 4th wave of the flu epidemic at the end of the First World War. Loads of people, tens of thousands of people attended her funeral because she was much loved by all sections of the working class movement in East London and beyond. Those are some of the tributes to her, and those are the 2 relevant books I've written on the subject.
Thank you very much, and it's lovely to be with you all. As was said, Minnie was my great aunt. Her sister Selina, after whom I'm named, was my grandma, and sadly I didn't know either of them. They both died long before I was born. My grandma Selina died in 1939 of cancer. The people who taught me most about Minnie were my 2 great aunts, Kate and Ray, who you see in this picture, who never married. They're in this picture with their brother Jaime, and they were like kind of surrogate grandparents to me. And they all grew up in this house in Chicksand Street off Brick Lane, which is much more famous now for its Bangladeshi restaurants, but was the heart of the Jewish East End that you've heard about from Janine. And incidentally, Janine talked to you about the little place near Warsaw where the family came from. I was due to be going to Poland. I've got somebody researching the family in Warsaw, and the plan was that in September I was going to be going there, but since COVID and all the rest of it, they haven't been able to do their research, and I ain't going to Warsaw in September, but hopefully next year in September my plan is to go and visit this little town that Janine found for me, although we don't expect to find very much there, but that's the plan. Oops, hang on, what's happening? Right, so here we are moving, yes, so the next picture I have is one of Minnie and Edgar in their garden in the East End after they were married. She was quite a kind of trendy woman for her time, really. I don't think there were that many women of her time who went around dressed like that. It kind of gives you something of her character. My great aunts that you saw in that first picture had a lovely old desk, which I still have in my house, and it was crammed full of pictures all about Minnie. And when I used to go round to their house, they used to regale me with stories all about her. And she was my heroine, and she affected me very much when I was growing up. And my future life, I think, was very much governed by her. This picture shows the little girl is my auntie, my father's sister, who was called Ruth. And my grandmother is in this picture too. Also with them is, I think, one of my other great aunties. And I've got a picture here to show you. This is my grandmother, Selina. Quite a lovely picture of her. That's another one we've got again. Now here, as you were told very briefly by Janine at the end, my great auntie died very tragically on January the 1st from influenza, part of the flu epidemic that kind of killed more people at the end of the war across the world than had died in the war. And I mean, a pandemic that's so very topical to us today. And I've got this very tatty poster that was there advertising a memorial mass meeting that they held in Bow Baths after her death. Although she was born Jewish, she kind of gave up her religion. But interestingly, she was cremated, and then her ashes were buried in the Jewish cemetery, which was incredibly unusual because in those days, the Orthodox Jewish religion didn't recognize anything to do with cremation. So it was something very unusual in those days. And here I've got, this is another thing I have, which is the mass meeting that they had where they had poems and various things. And this is an Eleanor Fargen poem that they read out. Now, I don't know how many of you know Bow well, but there is a famous clock, which I'm going to show you a picture of in a minute, that was erected in the 1930s in memory of Minnie. And in order to raise the funds to build this clock, they had these tiny little cards that used to sell for a penny in aid of the Minnie Lansbury Memorial Fund. And I've still got one of these little cards. And then eventually the clock was built in the 1930s, but it rather went into disrepair later on, and it was on electric house. It was built in the 1930s, but in 2007 I learnt from the newspaper The Jewish Chronicle that the East End Jewish Celebration Society with the Heritage of London Trust were trying to restore the clock. And this photo is at the restoration of the clock, which took place, as you can see, October 2008. We had a rededication ceremony. We were very fortunate. We got some help from California. Very briefly, the reason it came from California was that after Minnie died, Edgar remarried. He married an actress called Mona McGill, and together they had children. Minnie and Edgar never had any children. They had a daughter and 2 sons. Edgar himself died in London in 1935, and Mona and her children went off to America. the daughter that he had with Mona was called Angela. Angela Lansbury, who some of you may know, became a very famous actress. And although not in any way directly related to Minnie, she's still been a supporter of hers, and she gave money towards the restoration of this clock. And people, somehow they didn't know that Minnie had any surviving relatives. I kind of made out myself known to them. My father was still alive in his 90s, and he and I went to this, and they asked me who I would like to come and kind of cut the ribbon. And I suggested they had Una King, who'd previously been the MP at Bethnal Green and Bow. So she came and spoke, and we had a debate at the Central Foundation Girls' School in Bow, and we talked about the present day situation for women leaders. So it was a fantastic event, and here is the clock in all its glory. And then there's an extra little bit to the story, very, very briefly. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I've got one little more story to tell you, which goes on to 2018. This is at the time of, you may recall that Gillian Waring was asked to produce a statue of Millicent Fawcett, the first woman who ever had her statue in Parliament Square. And this was unveiled on the 24th of April, 2018. And at the bottom of Millicent Fawcett's statue are pictures of 54 women and 4 men who supported women's suffrage. And I was invited to this unveiling. You'll see why in a minute. Unfortunately, I was away on holiday at the time and I couldn't go, but my daughter went. My daughter is the dark-haired girl here at the front with the red lipstick. Next to her is her good friend Georgia Gould, who some of you might recognise, who's the leader of Camden Council. And here is my daughter standing on the statue, and she went very proudly along holding Minnie's picture, because if you have a look here, there are Minnie and Edgar, because they were 2 of the people honoured to be at the bottom of Millicent Fawcett's statue. So if any of you, when you now can, get to Trafalgar Square and go and have a look at the bottom of Millicent Fawcett's statue, you will see Minnie and George Lansbury at the bottom of Millicent Fawcett's statue. So there we are. Brings the story up to date.